I want to share with you how Queen Esther was faced with the most difficult task and how she managed to save the Jews. This is one of the most incredible stories there are. Mordechai tasked Esther. He sends her a message. He says, the Jews are in trouble. I heard that Haman wants to destroy the Jews. Go speak to your husband, the king Ahasuerus. Esther says, it's impossible. I'm sorry. It's too hard. And Mordechai answers her. He says, you have an opportunity now to save the Jews. If you want, seize the opportunity, seize the moment. If you don't want, Revach ve'Hatzalah, salvation will be found for the Jews through a different agent. But you will lose the privilege and pleasure and honor of being an agent to save the Jews. So Esther says, okay, I'll do it. What does she do? Ahasuerus had a rule. Her husband had a rule that only somebody who he calls to be summoned to speak to him can be seen by him. But if not, then I'm sorry, you can't. So she was, so first thing she does is when a Jew's faced with a crisis, you fast and you pray and you daven to Hashem. That's what she did. But then she went to Ahasuerus. She comes to her husband, the king, and she says, I have a big problem. What's the problem, my dear beloved queen? He genuinely loved her. She says, I want you and Haman to come to a feast. At the feast, I'll tell you what the issue is. Fine. Ahasuerus goes, prepares himself, prepares Haman, and they come to this beautiful feast that Esther does. At the feast, Ahasuerus is intrigued. He's curious. He says, my dear beloved wife, what can I do for you? I'll give you half the kingdom. And she says, my request is that you and Haman should come to a feast that I'm going to do tomorrow night. And at the feast, the second night, Ahasuerus asks her, what do you want? And she says, I have a terrible problem. Haman wants to kill us. And then Ahasuerus saves the Jews. The question is, why ask for 2 meals? Why ask for a second meal? If I'm a broker and I want a business with you, or if I'm a fundraiser and I want to fundraise from you, so I'll call you up and I say, Chaim Yankel, can you please meet me for lunch? I'll take you out to Reserve Cut. We'll go out for lunch. We'll have some wine. We'll have some food together. And I'll say, I have a beautiful campaign. Can you please give me $50,000 support this campaign? But if at the lunch I'll tell you, Chaim Yankel will ask, what do you want? And I'll say, I want to take you out for lunch tomorrow. That's already chutzpahdik. That's already, what? Why ask for a second meal? And it's here that we learn of Esther's most brilliant plan in the most incredible way. She laid a trap for Ahasuerus and Haman, and she played one against the other. You see, Esther, when she said to Mordechai, the mission is too difficult, it was too difficult. Mordechai convinced her to save the Jews. But now it was extremely difficult. Haman hated the Jews. Ahasuerus hated the Jews. How could she save the Jews? So she analyzed Ahasuerus. She analyzed Haman. She figured out what are each one's weak spots. And when she figured out what their weak spots are, she played one against the other. And the Megillah hints to all of this with one word, which I'll share with you soon. So she played, what's Ahasuerus' weak spot? So she analyzes. The Megillah begins, Ahasuerus made a party for 180 days. Who makes a party for all his subjects, for so long? You make a party for a bar mitzvah, you make it for 2 hours, a wedding, a day, a night. 180 days, 6 months of partying. Who does such a thing? Ahasuerus, who was he? He was Mr. Nobody. He was a stable boy. He was a person who looked after the horses of King Belshazzar. Belshazzar's daughter Vashti, the queen, the princess, went out one day and she fell in love with a stable boy, the guy cleaning the horses. That was Ahasuerus. So Ahasuerus became king when Belshazzar died, and Vashti kept on reminding him, I'm the queen, you just Mr. Nobody. So he made a party for 180 days because he wanted to show everybody, look at me, I'm the king, look at me, I'm great, I'm famous. He was paranoid that somebody else would usurp the throne from him. When he asked his wife Vashti to appear in front of him, she said, I'm the queen. What do you mean? You're asking me to appear in front of you? Who are you? And that enraged him. And he said, I will show you who's the boss. And he has her killed. Who has their wife killed? He was crazy. He was paranoid that somebody would take away his kingdom. He made a rule. Nobody's allowed to appear in front of me unless I summon them. Who does such a thing? Haman was the only one who had the ear of the king, and Haman kept on feeding him conspiracy theories. Oh, this guy's trying to make a coup against you. This guy's trying to make a coup against you. This guy's trying to he has him killed. He has him killed. He was paranoid. That was his weakness. He was completely paranoid. And now let's look at the one word of the Megillah that hints to all this. By the first party, by the first event, the first dinner, Esther says to Achashverosh, I want you and Haman to come to the meal, the feast, Asher Asiti Lo, that I'm doing for you, Achashverosh, in the singular. And Achashverosh was flattered. Wow, that's so beautiful. Of course I'm coming. And at the meal, what Esther did is she was speaking to Haman. She was friendly with him, a little bit too friendly. And she's telling Achashverosh, there's a coup, there's a big problem. She's feeding his paranoia. She's telling him, big Taurus, big problem. Feeding his paranoia. He's thinking, what's the issue? What's the problem? And at that meal, at that feast, he asks her, what do you want? And she says, I want to invite you and Haman to a feast that I'm going to do for you. Lahem in the plural. And Achashverosh is like, what's going on? Suddenly, his most trusted person, Haman, he can't even ask because he doesn't understand what's going on here. She's feeding his paranoia. And that one word wasn't lost on Achashverosh. The Megillah tells us that night between the two feasts, Achashverosh couldn't sleep. He had a sleepless night. Why? Because she was feeding his paranoia. She was feeding. One second, the first meal she invited only me. Now she's inviting me and Haman. Like, what's going on here? Haman is equal to me. She's telling me there's a coup. She's telling me there's something dangerous going on. She's feeding his paranoia. Let's go to Haman. Esther analyzes Haman and she realizes this man has a weak spot, one weak spot. What is that? His ego. In the Megillah's own words, after the first meal, lavished him with attention. He comes home to his wife Zeresh and she asks him, how was your day? And he says to her, do you know what happened today? The queen invited, out of the whole universe, she invited only me. He was like flattered. She pulled him up. And then he says to his wife, everything I have is worth nothing. Why? Because there's one Jew, Mordechai, who doesn't bow down to me. Who speaks like that? The guy was the richest guy in the world. He had power, he had fame. Every single person in the universe had to bow down to him, and they did when he passed with his horse. Only one thing he didn't have in the whole world, one Jew refused to bow down to him, and his words are, nothing is worth anything to me because of this one Jew. Who speaks like that? Somebody who's on steroids. His ego is on steroids. He needs everything. So Esther realizes this is his weak spot. She plays his weak spot against Achashverosh's weak spot, and she destroys them both. How does she do it? At the feast, she lavished Haman with attention. She lavished him, praised him, and spoke to him, and told him, oh, you both are invited for the meal. And he was like, wow, this is amazing. And he didn't even realize that she was burying him. She was building his grave for him. At the second feast, after Achashverosh spent a sleepless night because she was feeding his paranoia, and after Haman, she was feeding his ego, feeding his ego, so he comes inflated. Achashverosh asks her, what is wrong? And she tells him, I have a big problem. She's slowly feeding his paranoia. I have a big problem. What is it? What is your problem? My nation is under attack. Whoa, what? Slowly she tells him, my nation is under attack, and there's a horrible person who's doing this, who's threatening me. And Achashverosh, like, worst fears are materialized. Like, what? Somebody's threatening my wife. Who's your nation? And then she reveals that I'm Jewish. And he says, who is responsible? And she says, Haman. And Haman didn't see this coming. Like, what? He thought this was his friend. Esther was feeding him. She completely disarmed him. And Achashverosh was so angry, he goes outside. And just then Haman realizes he's in big trouble, so he falls at her feet. And Achashverosh comes in and he thinks that Haman is sleeping with his wife. And that is exactly what she wanted. She wanted to create this wedge between Haman and Achashverosh, and she did. And Achashverosh was enraged. And he heard then that Haman had built a tree 50 amot high. He said, go hang Haman on this tree. That is how she did it. She figured out What is Achashverosh's weak spot? What is Haman's weak spot? She played one against the other, disarmed Haman, played Achashverosh, and that is how Queen Esther saved the day. A task, a mission in which she told Mordechai initially, it's impossible, I cannot save the Jews. Well, she did it. This is the inner story behind the whole story of the Megillah. When faced with a challenge, the first thing we do as Jews is pray. The Jews had sacrificed. They prayed to Hashem that whole year. They sacrificed themselves for Hashem. But after you do that, you make a plan. After you pray, you make a plan. You jump in, you do it, you fulfill it, and God will help you. This is the most beautiful story of the Megillah. Hope you enjoyed. May you have a joyous Purim.